Early bird registration is now open for Fertility Awareness Mastery Live, and I know you'll love this program. Fertility Awareness Mastery is my 8-week group coaching program designed to help you gain confidence using fertility awareness. Whether you're actively avoiding pregnancy or looking to optimize your cycles for conception, we have a spot for you. We start the first week of May. Will you be joining us? Head over to fertilityfriday.com/FAM, as in Fertility Awareness Mastery, FAM, to register today. That's fertilityfriday.com/FAM. This episode is brought to you by the Fertility Awareness Mastery Charting Workbook, the first beautifully designed, fully customizable paper charting workbook designed with you in mind. With 3 years worth of charting pages, the Fertility Awareness Mastery Charting Workbook has you covered. If you've been looking for a solid alternative to charting apps, you'll love this charting workbook. The Fertility Awareness Mastery Charting Workbook is available in both Fahrenheit and Celsius editions, and it's available in spiral-bound, paperback, and ebook versions. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/workbook to order your copy today. That's fertilityfriday.com/workbook. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 310. Welcome to the Fertility Friday podcast, your source for information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility. I'm your host, Lisa Hendrickson-Jack. I'm the author of The Fifth Vital Sign and the Fertility Awareness Mastery Charting Journal. I'm a certified fertility awareness educator and holistic reproductive health practitioner with nearly 20 years of experience teaching women to connect to their fifth vital sign through menstrual cycle charting, balancing hormonal health, and optimizing the menstrual cycle without hormones. I'm outspoken about hormonal birth control and its impact on fertility and overall health because you have the right to know how your body works and how artificial hormones disrupt that natural process. I host live coaching programs to help you achieve optimal fertility and health because it's important to have healthy menstrual cycles regardless of whether or not you want to have babies. I'm also a wife and mother of 2 beautiful boys. I know, I'm a busy girl, but I managed to fit it all in. This podcast is designed to empower you to take full control of your cycles, your fertility, and your overall health. And I'm so excited that you're here with us today. Today I'm sharing a very important and informative episode. I'm sharing a new installment of the Pill Reality series. I'm interviewing Amanda, who is a member of the Fertility Friday community, and she is sharing her experience with hormonal contraceptives. In her case, she experienced one of the most egregious side effects being an actual stroke that she experienced. And so she shares what that was like, what led up to it, and how she recovered, and subsequently how she is managing her fertility now. So without further ado, let's jump into today's conversation with Amanda. So I'm excited to be here today with Amanda. Amanda and I connected through my Facebook group, I believe. Of course, when she was sharing a little bit about her birth control story, it really struck me. So I invited her to come to the show and talk a little bit about it. So Amanda, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Well, I'd love to start by just going into a little bit of your history, your period history, and then of course getting into your contraceptive history. So would you be able to share with us, if you remember, when you got your first period, what that was kind of like, what your cycles were like, if you've used birth control, and how that went? Like, how old were you when you started, and all of those things?
Yeah, of course. So if I remember correctly, I think I started my period when I was about 12 or 13 years old. And I remembered it was just very irregular from the start. I had really long periods where I would bleed for sometimes 3 to 4 weeks at a time. They weren't super heavy to start, but as I got into, being like 14, 15 years old, they just got ridiculously heavy. And I was miserable. And it's really hard, when you're 14, you're a freshman in high school and still trying to navigate all of the awkwardness that comes with being that age. And it was terrible. And for whatever reason, when I was that age, my mom was not a big fan of me using tampons either. So I had to use a pad for everything. And, just having to go to school every day repeatedly wearing like a pad, you're just so awkward and embarrassed. And I'm like, oh, I hope nobody can see the lines through my pants. And it was just a really awful time. So I remembered right around the time I was 15, I had just had enough. And I started talking to my mom because I had heard some girls around school saying that their doctors had put them on the pill just to help manage, period flow and acne and all these other things that I was also experiencing as a teenage girl. My mom was open to it. We went to the doctor and my doctor thought, yep, it was perfect time to get put on birth control. She was actually going to suggest it had I not brought it up. And so then I was prescribed just a generic brand of low estrogen, I believe. And that's kind of where it all began. I was either 15 or 16 when I got on birth control.
Mm-hmm. Well, and what was your experience like? I mean, I think a lot of women can relate to the awkwardness. And I was having a conversation a little while ago where I said, it would be nice if instead of separating the boys and the girls and having different conversations, we could just maybe separate into smaller groups and have a conversation with the boys and the girls to kind of make the school a safe zone for the girls and the boys, right? Because you just feel so uncomfortable, and the boys are never provided with a proper adult conversation that periods are normal. It's not okay to make fun of girls if you see like pads are a part of life, and like pull them out and show everybody, let the giggles come out, but just deal with it in a better way so that it's kind of like adults are saying it's not okay to, I don't know.
I know, absolutely. And I feel like at that age too, I mean, even as an adult, like female periods are so taboo, I think, to talk about. And, when you're going through adolescence, you're not really receiving any support from, certainly like the sexual education courses that you take in high school are ridiculous. They don't teach you anything about your reproductive cycle. So, I mean, just there's such a lack of information that women receive from a very early age about their menstrual cycles. And I think that really just makes it such an uncomfortable situation to deal with. Like women just, when they're that age, it's just seen as an inconvenience and you don't want anything to do with it. And it's just really unfortunate that that's sort of how we start this process of our reproductive cycle at such a young age.
Mm-hmm. Well, so you were about 15 years old and you were able to address it. So share with us then, were you on the pill and then cycling, or getting not cycling because you don't cycle on the pill, but were you on the pill and still getting a withdrawal bleed, or did you sort it out so that you wouldn't have to have them as frequently?
Yeah. So when I initially started, I think for about the first year, I was just doing the standard packaging where it was like the 3 weeks of the pill and the 4th week of the sugar pills. And that worked well, I will say. I mean, my periods definitely did regulate. My acne did clear up a little bit, but I don't really remember having any other symptoms with it. But as I was getting into my late teens, I was always very athletic and playing a lot of sports in high school and into college. And, my doctor, when I went in for a checkup, was like, we can prolong you having a period even longer if you just skip your sugar pills on a monthly basis. And we can maybe give you a period about 4 times a year versus having one every year. And she was like, how does that sound to you? In my mind, I'm thinking that's fantastic. Like, the few amount of periods that I have every year, the better, right? So I did that for several years up until I was probably 19, 20 years old. I don't honestly remember having really any adverse effects or any like breakthrough bleeding, anything like that. It was all pretty consistent for me.
Okay. And so then at some point, did you switch to a different type of contraceptive method, or did you stay on the kind of having the withdrawal bleed a few times a year?
So I was pretty consistent on that pill for about 5 years. I don't remember my dose really changing at all. The only thing that had really changed, like I mentioned, was skipping some of the sugar pills on monthly basis. But what initially had happened, so I was 19 going on 20. I remember it very distinctly. It was just a huge moment in my life. I had just finished my fall semester of my sophomore year of college, and we were on winter break around Christmas time. And all of a sudden, I started having really, really severe migraines out of nowhere, which was really unusual for me because I was never a headache person. I'd rarely ever gotten them. And they just came on all of a sudden. And it had gone on for about a week and a half. And finally, I got to the point where I was like, this is unusual. Like, it's happening every single day consistently. They're getting worse, not better. So I went into the local hospital that was down the street from my parents' house. And I went in to get evaluated by a doctor. And I was just like, look, like, I know that I'm young, I'm healthy, but I've been having really frequent headaches. I have no idea what's going on. and they're just getting worse, like to the point where it's like ongoing migraines throughout the day. I started experiencing some really bad vertigo. Like I was just not well. And the doctor that I had seen completely brushed me off. I mean, he was a jerk, to be honest, just looked at me and kind of scoffed and was like, if you're expecting me to write you a prescription for something, it's not going to happen. And I was like, yeah, that's absolutely not why I'm here. Yeah, it was terrible. I mean, he totally treated me like I was some degenerate young adolescent that was coming in looking for a pain pill prescription. So he shrugged me off and sent me home. He's like, I can give you an IV of like the equivalent of extra strength Tylenol if that's something that you would prefer, but otherwise there's nothing I can do for you. And just sent me home. So I was feeling pretty discouraged, but thinking like, I'm probably just overreacting. It's in my head. But 2 days later, I was at work and my migraine was so severe that I couldn't even look at the computer screen any longer. I felt like I was starting to black out a little bit. My vertigo was just unreal. So I ended up leaving home early for the day. And I wasn't living with my parents at the time. I was living with roommates in college, but I was going over to my parents' house to have dinner because it was a Sunday evening. And I went to the local pharmacy before going to my parents' house to pick up some migraine medication. Unfortunately, I started having stroke-like symptoms when I was at the pharmacy, and I didn't realize what was happening at the time.
Wow, first of all, I don't really have a lot of words. I mean, but I wanted to, so we'll get into it a little bit more, but I did want to ask when you said you had stroke-like symptoms at the pharmacy of all, I mean, it's not, but what were those symptoms?
Yeah. So, I mean, I wasn't very in tune with what was happening when it initially started. So I was up at the cashier getting ready to check out and pay for my medication. And I started swiping my hand against the credit card machine. And the guy at the cash register was looking at me just baffled, like, ma'am, you have to have a credit card in your hand. What are you doing? And I was just very spacey. I'm like, oh my gosh, I didn't even realize what I was doing. I'm sorry, I'm zoning out. And so I grabbed my credit card and I paid for it, but I left my purse and my wallet on the counter as I was walking out to my car. The guy had to chase me down in the parking lot and give me my stuff. It's really scary to think back now, but I did get in my car and I drove to my parents' house. Luckily it was only about a half mile down the road. But I mean, I hit the curb when I was driving to my parents' house. I fell out of my car when I parked in front of their house, walking up to their driveway. And my dad was out in the garage doing some sort of maintenance on his car. And he looked at me and he's like, why are you so frazzled? What's going on? And, I was so confused. I'm like, I don't know. Like, it's really strange. I'm not feeling well. And, I proceed to walk into the house. I trip up the step going into my parents' porch. And my mom looks at me and I start crying all of a sudden. She's like, what is wrong? And I open my mouth to speak and all of a sudden the words won't come out. And I'm just trembling and I'm stuttering. And I started panicking at that point because I knew something was very wrong. And my mom looks at me and she can just see her like fear in my eyes. And I was able to just muddle out like hospital, I need to go to the hospital. My mom doesn't handle stress well. So she was, instantly freaking out. She called 911. She was worried that the ambulance wouldn't be able to get here in time. So we got in the car and my mom started driving me to another hospital because we refused to go back to the initial hospital that had just dismissed me, 2 days prior. And so I started just going in and out of consciousness in the car getting to the hospital. And then finally my mom had to pull over because I was blacking out completely and we had to wait for an emergency service vehicle to come meet us. And then I was transported to the hospital in the ambulance. So then when we got to the emergency room, I started to come to again. I had a little bit of consciousness. I was able to speak somewhat coherent sentences, but it was very short-lived. I ended up started going back into blacking out again, losing consciousness. So they rushed me back to evaluate me immediately. And there was an on-call neurologist who did my initial evaluation when I was checked into the emergency room. And, my motor skills were all out of whack. He was asking me, who the president of the United States was. I literally said Georgina Washington. Like, I have no idea where that even came from. My mom was standing there just mind blown. I didn't know my name. I didn't know what year it was. Like, I was just completely gone mentally. And so they rushed me back to do an emergency CT scan to check my brain. And they found a clot at the base of my jugular vein and my venous sinus. And the doctor diagnosed me with having a stroke.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, that when you were describing that moment with your mom when you could barely speak, yeah, that brought me to tears.
Yeah. It was just, I mean, I remember a lot of what happened. Bits and pieces of the day are definitely, lost to me, but I just remember the emotions being in the emergency room too. Like my best friend had come, my mom had texted her saying like, Amanda's in the hospital. Seeing my mom and dad at the base of my bed, like it was just the weirdest feeling. The best way I can describe how I felt was like, I was aware of what was going on around me, but for some reason, like my own identity was like foreign to my brain. Like I couldn't, reconcile the fact that like I was Amanda, I was inside my own body. It was almost like I was watching like a TV show and that was just like the world around me. Like I remember conversing with my friends, but I didn't know they were talking to me. It was like I was just watching the whole thing as like an outsider looking in. But, seeing my parents so emotional. I mean, my mom says still to this day, it is like the scariest thing she's ever been through in her life. And, we got a really unclear prognosis from the doctor. They weren't sure what kind of, residual damage that my brain could have and what effects that would have on my cognition, on my motor skills. I mean, it was all so soon to really understand what the impact that the stroke was going to have on my life and my body. So, I mean, I just, I still look back at that time now and it was just horrifying. There was so much uncertainty.
Well, so you're 19 going on 20.
I just turned 20. It happened 4 days after my 20th birthday.
Well, yeah, happy birthday.
Yeah, I know, right?
So you're 20 years old in the middle of you said sophomore year of college?
Yeah.
And so then what happens now? Like to talk to us about kind of like the recovery and what that looked like for you.
Yeah, so I was in the hospital in ICU for 7 days and then they sent me home. And like I said, this happened during winter break for my college classes. So I was still weighing out the decision with my parents of whether I wanted to take a semester off and just kind of give myself a break. But I've always been really determined to get through my education as quickly as possible. And I started feeling better once I was just out of the hospital and I was home. I mean, there were still some things. I noticed I had a little bit of a stutter in my speech for probably 2 weeks after the stroke, but it had gotten better. So I decided to end up going back to school that semester. And so I went back to school probably 3 weeks after my stroke, which in hindsight, looking back, I probably should have just taken a semester off. But, so I was on warfarin, which is just the generic form of Coumadin, which is a blood thinner. I had to take that for 6 months following the stroke. I had to go in every single week and sometimes twice a week to go get my blood thickness checked to ensure that they didn't need to manipulate my dosage at all. I had to change my diet a little bit because when you're on those blood thinners, you tell you to stay away from foods containing vitamin K. So, no leafy greens, kale, things like that, which I really loved. So it was kind of an adjustment. And I was also a pretty avid runner. So I was told to scale that back for a while I was on the blood thinners, just because I didn't want to risk, tripping or falling and having really severe, bruising, internal bleeding, all of the side effects, unfortunately, that come with being on a blood thinner. So it was a really weird time. I just felt like I kind of had to put my normal life on pause for a while until I got the clear from doctors that I was able to be off of the blood thinning medication and kind of just in the clear of not having to worry about this happening again. But obviously I got off the birth control immediately. The doctors did a ton of blood tests when I was in the hospital to just check and see if, maybe I had some sort of blood clotting condition that was hereditary, anything like that would have been a red flag, and they found nothing. So we had to rule out that it was the hormonal birth control pill that caused the stroke.
Well, that was going to be one of my next questions. So when this all went down, how did the doctors, so obviously they were testing and thinking, of course, it couldn't be the pill. She has to have a hereditary condition, which is really frustrating. But so how did that conversation take place? Was it the doctor that said you need to come off of birth control pills? And were you given some sort of, I suppose, instruction or direction about future pill use?
Initially, no. So when I was in the hospital and it had happened, all the doctors were like, you're done with the birth control. We're getting off right now. Once things have, kind of settled down, you can go meet up with your OBGYN and, kind of discuss what the future will look like in terms of birth control. But for now, we're done with it. Yeah, after I had been in recovery for about 6 months, I was not in any sort of steady relationship or anything like that. And I wasn't sexually active at that time. So I didn't feel the need to really even start thinking about getting back on birth control again until about a year later. And during that time period, I don't remember too much what had happened to my cycle. I don't remember anything out of the normal. I think I did kind of get back into the routine of having a relatively normal cycle. But I did end up talking with my doctor about a year later to be put on the Mirena IUD because I was in a committed relationship at that time. I was having still some issues with acne and things like that. My periods did get a little more irregular as I was in my early 20s. So my doctor felt that, we'll stay away from anything that secretes estrogen or the synthetic form of estrogen, but she thought that I would be okay with the progesterone. So that's why she prescribed me the Mirena IUD.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to just hang back on a couple of parts of your story. For anyone who's listened to, several of or a few of the Pill Reality series, especially the ones that are discussing more serious conditions like stroke and pulmonary embolism. And there was one where the woman who I was interviewing experienced an ectopic pregnancy, and it was obviously needed emergency surgery and those types of things. So the more serious situations, one of the common and recurring themes in these conversations has been the repeated and continual dismissal by medical professionals. And so in your situation, what you described was that you were having these migraines, and it wasn't migraine. It wasn't that you had a migraine on Monday. From what you described, you were having migraines every day, and you said the word continuous, and enough so that you went to the hospital.
Yep, I went into the ER.
Yeah. And so this is something that's so important, I think, for all women just to hear and for us to spend a little bit of time here. If you have symptoms that are distressing enough to you that you take yourself into the hospital, if a doctor is dismissing you and ignoring you, first of all, we have to, it's kind of like we have to band together and share these stories so that you can hear that this is very common. Even in cases where you have a potentially life-threatening issue, it is very common, even in those cases, to still be dismissed. What, if anything, would you want to tell that doctor or the women listening who, because this is life-threatening, you could be, how many women have been in a situation like that where they're actually experiencing a life-threatening condition and they go to the hospital and they're basically told that it's in their head, go home.
Yeah, it's so disheartening. I mean, I like to give the benefit of the doubt, and I think there are so many really wonderful, medical providers and practitioners out there that do genuinely want the best for their patients. And hopefully my situation with that particular doctor was maybe he was just having an off day. I like to give people grace, but it was incredibly disheartening and demoralizing to think that I wouldn't even be evaluated, that he treated me like I was coming in and just flat out lying to him. Like I was looking for him to write me a prescription for pain medication. And I feel for all of the other women that have been in similar situations because it just sucks. I mean, you want to feel empowered and your own body better than anyone else. And I've always prided myself in being very in tune with my body. And it's very easy for us to pick up when things are not right. And to have a medical provider not believe you and not want to evaluate you, I mean, it's just, where do you go from there then? If that's supposed to be the authority that is going to help you when you express you're having symptoms. So yeah, it's really disheartening.
Yeah, it's tough. And you said something as well, if I'm remembering correctly, you mentioned that, after that experience, having the doctor be so dismissive, you had that moment of like, am I overreacting? Is it in my head? And see, it's fully like full on medical gaslighting in that situation so I think that one of the reasons and benefits, or one of the many reasons why I'm always talking about charting and getting in tune with your cycles is because the more that you start to connect with whatever's happening in your body. And it's interesting because it's connecting with your cycle is kind of like step one. And a lot of women then, because they're just paying attention to those signs, start to pay attention to other signs. So for many women, it's that is the entrance way for them, but it helps them to connect overall with their body and pay attention to their symptoms and start to see certain patterns, and that builds confidence. So if you feel something that's out of the ordinary, you feel more confident in, okay, this is a problem. And so if anything, because it breaks my heart to think that you could have been on the verge of having a stroke and the doctor basically sent you home and you were left to question if you were overreacting. So I hope that if the listeners can take something from this conversation, it's that we really have to trust our own intuition, and we got to be the difficult patients. If the doctor isn't taking you seriously, I mean, you're right, Amanda, to say, yeah, maybe the doctor was having a bad day. Obviously, there's an issue with medical training. If you can have a young woman on hormonal birth control having these migraines, and for the doctor for it not to be standard for the doctor to say, are you on birth control?
Yeah, I know.
Because we know just to have a standard procedure around young women with headaches, because that's a real thing. We know it happens. And if you are experiencing severe migraines, and you're on birth control, that is something that is indicative of an increased potential risk of something more serious. So I'll get off my soapbox now.
You're fine. We have the same soapbox.
Yes. But that's something, because again, it's so important for us to trust our own intuition. And if something is bad enough that you go to the hospital, right? I mean, yeah, you can't just because the doctor says it's just go to another doctor. Don't give up. Don't give up.
Yeah, definitely don't give up. And like you said, you just have to advocate for yourself. I mean, in hindsight, looking back, hindsight is always 20/20. But I mean, had I known that the situation was more severe than what I had even been able to conceptualize, I would have pushed for that doctor to give me a CT scan at a minimum to at least evaluate, my brain and make sure that everything was okay. And, I mean, I just think, like you said, you have to trust your intuition. And if you truly feel like something is wrong, you have to fight for yourself.
Well, and to take it a step further, because of course I always have to go there, when it comes to informed consent, this is why I just keep going on about informed consent and how important it is. And so obviously not all women who take combined synthetic estrogen, progestin, birth control formulations have strokes. We all know this. We know that it's a relatively small percentage in the grand scheme of things. However, we do know that the pill does increase the chance of something like this happening. We do know that there are how many women, I don't know, but we do know that this affects thousands, if not tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of women worldwide. So these are the things that we know. So when you're going on this type of a medication, imagine the alternative universe where your doctor just took 10 minutes and said, look, this birth control is really effective and it in preventing pregnancy. And there's also these other non-medical reasons why we, off-label reasons why we use it. So, for most women, they don't really experience XYZ problems, but you need to know that if you experience an increasing severe kind of migraine headache or a series or episode of that could be indicative of this. You should so I feel like that type of conversation is warranted. And with a lot of the different symptoms, if you start to feel anxious or depressed, then you need to know that could be related. But just to have that short 5-10 minute conversation of these are the symptoms that could indicate a big problem. Usually it's not something that, I haven't really had a lot of patients that have experienced these severe outcomes, but you should know. And then if you do experience them, either come back to me or go to the hospital. And I feel like that simple conversation could have changed the trajectory of your experience.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. And, just going back to what you said too about this may not be the most common, effect that women experience with being on hormonal birth control. It was actually just so, not funny, but kind of ironic to me. So when I was at that 6-month mark where I was finally off the Coumadin, I made a post on my Facebook page because I'd been kind of sharing my journey with just some family and friends that were following it, that were concerned, and, finally said that I was off the blood thinning medication and things were great. I was going back to live my life again. And it was one of the girls that I had gone to high school with, I was an acquaintance, had seen my post and reached out to me through a direct message and just said, hey, oh my gosh, I heard about what happened to you. And I just wanted to connect with you and talk because the exact same thing happened to me 2 months ago. And I was completely shocked because, like you said, it doesn't seem like it's as common of a thing, but, it was just crazy and maybe coincidence, but someone in my, relatively near social circle had experienced the exact same thing as me, months following my stroke. And it was just very eye-opening to me. I mean, we were on completely different types of birth control, different doses, and it could happen at any time. And it is more common than I think we realize.
Well, and some women don't survive it.
Yeah. And then there's that too. I mean, how fortunate were the two of us that we could be having a conversation about it after the fact. And her and I were both, we talked about not really having any, residual or, just any sort of negative effects from the stroke, very fortunately, but that's also not the reality for a lot of people. I mean, any sort of stroke where you lose blood loss to major organs, especially your brain, like, you can experience paralysis, speech impediments. I mean, a long list of just horrible, horrible side effects. And I mean, it's just very scary.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I mean, it brings to, why talk about this? Why continue to interview women who've had these types of experiences on birth control? Am I 100% anti-birth control? And it always comes back to, this is something, it's a medication. And I think a lot of us don't even think of it as a medication. That's something that I've talked about quite a bit. It's so common and ubiquitous that I took the pill for a short couple years, maybe 2 to 3. I don't remember exactly, when I was teen. And I distinctly remember filling out forms when you go to different doctors and they say, are you on any medication? And I distinctly remember checking no, because it occurred to me that the pill was medication, and I'm not alone in that. I've had this conversation with so many girlfriends and so many clients and over the years. And this is a very common, I'm not sure if you had a similar experience, but when you're taking birth control, you often don't even think of it as a medication.
Yeah, totally.
And so, but at the end of the day, when you eat a banana, you're not likely to have like a stroke or a pulmonary embolism. So it is a medication. And it does have these adverse effects, and they know about them. And even it surprises me because not everybody knows that the pill has a black box warning. Not everybody knows that. And black box warnings are only given for drugs that actually have life-threatening side effects. So I think that if anything to take from this episode, it's just that it's real. It does happen to actual people. It's not like so rare that it never happens to anybody. And if anything, if I could wave a magic wand and change something about the world, the one thing with regards to this specific issue is that it would be really helpful for doctors to just quickly but thoroughly go through some of those risk factors so that you would know if there was a potential. It wouldn't, maybe it shows up differently in different women, but I feel like the migraines, the headaches, I feel like every woman who takes the pill should be told that if you start to develop consistent and chronic migraines, that we need to have a conversation and reevaluate if you should be taking an estrogen containing hormonal birth control.
Yeah.
Like, how simple is that?
I know.
That just rolled off my tongue.
I think you've been putting some thought into this.
Well, so to kind of switch gears a little bit, like obviously I'm hammering the point home because I just can't let it go. But but so you switched over to then the progestin containing IUD, the Mirena. And so is that something that you're still using, and how has your experience been with that?
No, unfortunately, I kind of had a negative experience with that too. I joke and say that I'm always like the 1% that, whenever you get the warning labels, like, oh, it's only 1% of the population that actually gets this. Like, I'm always that 1%. So I had the Mirena placed when I was 21. And I will say the first 3 years were pretty uneventful with it. I did have kind of like the standard 3 or 4 month spotting after placement, which I know is very common. But otherwise, once that went away, my period completely stopped. And again, at the time, not really understanding the importance of having a healthy menstrual cycle, I was just overjoyed that I didn't have a period for 3 years. And I did remember getting some random cramping throughout the month. I think when I was supposed to be having a cycle or possibly ovulating, I really don't know if I was ovulating or not. I didn't know how to check at the time. But after about 3 years, I started getting a period again, and it was super irregular. I was having a period, and then I was having breakthrough bleeding between cycles. And then out of nowhere, I started getting very, very severe pelvic pain, to the point where 1 month it was so bad. I was at work, and, we do this terrible thing where we go on Dr. Google and try to diagnose ourselves. The symptoms that I had, and it's funny you mentioned it earlier, but the symptoms that I had, I thought I was having an ectopic pregnancy. And I was horrified. I mean, I was in so much pain. It was debilitating. I could barely walk when I was at work. So I had my boyfriend take me to the emergency room that evening, and they did a CT scan on my abdomen. They did an ultrasound. I mean, couldn't find anything. And I was in so much pain. I mean, it was ridiculous. So, I had kind of just had to wait it out. Things didn't really get better. I went back to my gynecologist at the time, And she actually prescribed for me to be on the mini pill, which is just the progestin only pill, on top of having my Mirena. Because her reasoning behind it was like, well, the Mirena, it does kind of steadily secrete the progestin over, the span of 5 years that you have it. But maybe the progestin is just running a little low. So we can give you the mini pill and see if it helps offset some of your symptoms.
Okay, hold on.
Yeah.
Sorry. I'm going to have to chew on that one for a moment.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So just to be sure, just to be clear on what you just said, you had the Mirena inserted.
Mm-hmm.
And the Mirena is a progestin releasing IUD that women are often told is localized and stays in the uterus, but we have a circulatory system. So just for anyone who's listening, like, enough of that foolishness. I can't even believe people say that out loud. So then in addition to that, you already have an existing hormone releasing birth control device in your body, and your doctor is now suggesting that you have a second prescription for progesterone, the progesterone only pill. So it's often referred to as the mini pill. But so that was the suggestion, to put you on a pill when you already have an IUD inserted.
Yes.
Okay.
I know.
I would
love
to see the research for that, because I would love to see that, if the progesterone only pill is recommended for women who have an IUD.
Yeah.
But sorry, I just had to.
I know. And I will say, so I was on the mini pill, and at this point in time still, I had not done any of, the due diligence and the research to try to understand what was going on. That didn't come until shortly after this. But so I agreed, and I started taking the mini pill, and I did it for about 2 months, and it made things so much worse. Like, I was miserable. I was bleeding nonstop. I had pretty steady cramping. I mean, it wasn't debilitating, but it was very annoying. And I was just always just like in discomfort and just miserable.
So you did it. You took the prescription, filled it, and then, wow.
Yeah. And finally I got to the point where I called her office and just told her that they were trying to refill my prescription through the pharmacy. And I was like, I would prefer if you did it. I'm not taking it anymore. So I got off of that. I also had a lot of ovarian cysts. After I came off birth control from my stroke, I started developing ovarian cysts, which I had never had before. And so, my doctor told me, maybe you're having just frequent ovarian cysts on a monthly basis. That could be causing your pain, which was probable. We also, in that time frame, my doctor thought that possibly I could have had endometriosis, because my mom did. She was diagnosed with it about the same age that I was at the time, in my early 20s. So we also went through, and I had a laparoscopy performed to go in and check and see if I had endometriosis. And the doctor found nothing. So it wasn't that big of a deal at the end of the day, but to also have to go through and have an invasive surgery and still get zero sort of inclination as to what was going on with me. I mean, it was just very frustrating. And never once at the time did my doctor say anything about the Mirena being a problem.
Just wanted to jump into today's episode to give you an update. Registration is still open for Fertility Awareness Mastery Live, and we still have a spot available for you. I'm really excited to get started in the first week of May, and I would love for you to be joining us. Make sure to head over to fertilityfriday.com/FAM, that's FAM as in Fertility Awareness Mastery, to join us and to reserve your spot. Again, that's fertilityfriday.com/FAM. Now let's go ahead and jump back into today's episode. So
there was still no talk in removing it.
They did a laparoscopic surgery, and at no point did they say it could your pelvic pain and these symptoms could possibly be related to the Mirena. Like, that was
No.
It's like they'd rather do an exploratory surgery than to even pose the question of, could it be related to the IUD that's inserted in your uterus where the pain is emanating from?
Yeah, it was never once mentioned. And, I kind of get frustrated with myself looking back on it now, because it seems so clear to me that was the cause of what was happening. And I wish that I had just known, so I didn't have to go through all of those crazy things, like being put on a mini pill and agreeing to an invasive surgery that didn't find anything. And, it was just a very frustrating time. That was from when I was about 24 to 25 years old. And I was just, it was kind of a dark time. Like, I was just in pain all the time. I was in a relationship with my boyfriend and just had very low libido. Like, I didn't want to be touched ever. I was always bleeding. I was always cramping, like moody. Like, it was just terrible. And to not have any sort of answers as to what was going on with me was just so demoralizing.
Yeah, that's just terrible. It just sounds like a terrible experience. And one of the things you said, I wish I had known, and it seems so clear to me now. I mean, it always seems clear after the fact. But at the end of the day, I mean, none of the medical professionals in your life were at all concerned about it. So why would you have been?
Mm-mm. Yeah. Yeah. A few months had gone by and I had finally decided, after starting to do a little bit of research, and that's actually when I found your podcast and other similar resources. I had never heard about fertility awareness and managing, your reproductive cycle and your fertility just naturally. Like, that was such a novel concept to me, and I had no idea. I think, again, just comes from the lack of information. I think so many women, even in their adult years, don't realize that, very foundationally, if you are having a regular period, there's only a very specific window throughout the month in which you're fertile. And I didn't even know this. I was, just convinced in my early 20s that I needed some sort of birth control and I needed to make the situation work because I was not ready to have a child. And once I finally started finding resources such as your podcast and, other books, I remembered reading Taking Charge of Your Fertility. And it was just so eye-opening to me that, wow, I have been going through hell and back for the last 5 years of my life trying to navigate my fertility because I just believed that I needed to be on some sort of birth control, like hormonal birth control, to solve my problems. And in reality, I am capable of doing this naturally. And at that point, I had decided that I was going to make an appointment to go in and have my IUD removed. I had a little pushback from my doctor, but, she did understand. I said that, I'm learning about charting and taking my basal body temperature, and I was going to be very cautious using condoms and other protection for the time being until I felt comfortable. And, she, after a little bit of talking about it, she agreed. And I made an appointment to get my IUD removed, and she couldn't get it out. The string had fallen off, and for some reason the position of the IUD in my uterus, she couldn't reach it. At first she had thought it was not in there. We had to do an ultrasound and she found it, but I had to go in for 2 separate appointments. She had to dilate my cervix. It was so uncomfortable and painful, and she's kind of digging around in there with her tools, and I mean, it was horrible. Finally, at the end of that second appointment, she looked at me and she's like, "I'm so sorry, but we're going to have to surgically remove this thing because I can't get it out." So that was just the cherry on top of just my horrible experiences with hormonal birth control. So I went in, we had the surgery scheduled about, a month after that. She had it removed and everything has been fine ever since. But I was just God, this battle is never going to end. It was just so ridiculous.
Yeah, that really sounds like one thing after the other. When we were talking, you mentioned, if there's a 1% chance of something happening, it happens to me.
Mm-hmm.
What's interesting is that we think it's 1%, but it's not.
Yeah.
It's a much higher percent than we think. And having an issue with retrieving the IUD and having to have it either removed or having the strings go missing and those types of things, that's very common. It's not something that is 1%. I would have to do some research to see what the percentage is, but it's not so uncommon that it's rare for that to happen.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sorry that you had to experience so much challenge around birth control. And with the IUD, I had another question, but I'm not sure if I wanted to ask you, because one of the common threads that has kind of come out as I continue to do these Pill Reality series episodes, particularly with respect to the IUD, both the hormonal and the non-hormonal, is the insertion. So you mentioned the removal. Obviously, that was multi-part process.
Traumatic
and unsuccessful. But for the insertion, could you talk to us about if that was painful? And then when you mentioned that they dilated your cervix to try to remove the IUD, were you also given a numbing agent?
No, I was not given a numbing agent. I didn't even know it was something that I could ask for, honestly. So I had taken, some ibuprofen and things like that before going into the appointment with my doctor. But no, there was no numbing agent. She just did the dilation medication. And it was terrible. But also touching back on the insertion was really painful too. I had some friends that had gotten an IUD a few months before me, and they were, oh, it's so easy. It was a really quick process. None of them had children yet. I had heard that if you'd bared children before, that usually the insertion process is a little bit easier for doctors. But, all my friends were like, no, it was super chill, not a big deal. But when I went in, it was excruciating. I mean, I remember that day distinctly just because I was in so much discomfort. I was also dilated by my doctor at that time to have the IUD placed. Yeah. And just everything about it was so uncomfortable. It was quick, I would say. It was not like a long drawn out process. The most discomfort obviously is in like the first 30 seconds to minute. And then it sort of just goes down to kind of a mellow, just like pelvic pain and cramping for the rest of the day and some spotting. But yeah, would not recommend it. It was a horribly uncomfortable process.
Well, and it's interesting what you said as well, because you said, I didn't know that it was even possible for them to administer a numbing agent.
Mm-hmm.
And so after having this conversation with a number of clients, and also obviously with this series, what I've learned so far is that it is possible to have a numbing agent. It's rarely offered, but kind of the one unicorn doctor might offer it. And often if you do want it, which if you are thinking about having an IUD placed, inserted, or removed, it's a good idea to consider asking for it.
Mm-hmm.
But you may have to really push. So even if you have a legitimate concern about the pain, there's still this kind of medical gaslighting situation where it's just not really considered to be a big deal. I've also heard women say that the insertion, although very painful in some cases, is quick. So some women experience this intense pain for a short moment in time, and that might be why it's minimized. But I think what's helpful is to know that it is possible for the doctor to actually administer a numbing agent to the cervix. And it's also common for it to be a challenge if you want it, if like you have to push for it. But if you are thinking about having an IUD placed or removed, yeah, I would say that it's within your right to ask for a numbing agent, because not all women experience it as very painful, but it seems as though most women do.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah. Well, wow. You've really been through it with this birth control situation, Amanda. So to kind of bring it to a close where we're at now.
Mm-hmm.
So you had the IUD removed. You went through that whole process. And so share with us then what you've come to currently with how you're managing your fertility.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So my IUD was removed about a year and a half ago now. And I expected that, just because I had had some sort of hormonal birth control influencing my cycle for so many years of my reproductive life, that it was going to take a long time for my cycle to be normal. And to be honest, I didn't even know what a normal cycle looked like. I mean, it was such a new concept for me. And it was kind of exciting and scary to begin that journey, but it was very liberating to just know that like I am with my body. Nothing is influencing it. And like things are just going to get better with time. But I'm really happy to report that it only took me about 2 months to have quote unquote normal cycle. And, at that time, it was more than just my reproductive health that I was concerned about. With my doctors telling me that I was having ovarian cyst, I didn't get a definitive diagnosis of PCOS, but I started looking into that a little bit too. And, had learned that it was related to some insulin resistance, similar to being diabetic. Around that time, I was always a pretty clean eater, what I would consider by most kind of standard American diet, which, I completely disagree with now too. And that's a whole other can of worms we could go into. But I really changed my diet a lot, was really focusing a lot on just getting good quality sleep, eating whole, unrefined foods. And, my cycle, it was same around that time as when I had my IUD removed. And my cycle was just, perfect after 2 months. I was very consistent, 28-day cycle. Started having, my ovulatory fluid right around, day 9, day 10. Very consistent. So it made my charting so much simpler because I wasn't having to guess. And, it didn't take a long time to get into the groove. So I'm very fortunate. I know a lot of women don't always have that same experience, and it can take many months up to years before they have normal cycles, depending on what their metabolic conditions look like and things like that. So right now, currently for me, I will say, and I know this may make some women cringe, I'm not as, strictly tracking my cycle. I still am in a committed relationship. But my partner has been very, very supportive of this whole process too. He was with me when I was battling, in those final stages with my IUD, and just saw how miserable I was. So, we sort of embarked on this new journey together, and he's been very supportive. I actually have forced him to listen to some of your Fertility Friday podcasts. So he can, rather than taking it just from me, he can learn about, really what fertility awareness means, and, being in tune with your body, and just, reassuring him too, because I think men oftentimes don't know much about the female reproductive cycle too. And was also under the perception for a long time that like I can be fertile at any given point throughout the entire month. And so, really providing that education for him was hugely helpful. And we're in a very good place right now. So I'll say I'm not taking my basal body temperature in the mornings really at all anymore. I am still tracking cervical fluid very consistently, as well as just the length of my cycle. So, around the times when I'm predicting my fertile window, we're very, very cautious. We'll use condoms or we'll just abstain. We've been doing this for about the last year and a half now and have not had any concerns, any scares, anything. And we are actively avoiding pregnancy still. We're still kind of on the fence of whether we want children or not, but that will be years down the road. But, I'm very, very happy with where my body's at and my cycle's at now. And I just years ago didn't even know that this would be possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think for so many women who, especially when you've only been in a sexual relationship or an intimate relationship while on hormonal contraceptives, and you've never had to have those conversations and navigate that, it can really feel like this is the only way. I can't manage my fertility without hormones. And there seems to be this idea as well that not being on hormones means that you're trying to conceive. So I've had a lot of women have that experience of having an issue with some sort of hormonal birth control method, going to the doctor, okay, this isn't working for me. And basically the thought is if you're not on it, you're getting pregnant. It's just a matter of time. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's really important to continue to share the experiences of women so that, I always say, like, as a listener to the podcast, the majority of the women who are listening are adults who have very complicated lives, who've often gone through very complicated programs in school, who have very demanding and complicated jobs, lots of responsibility in life. And so it's very ironic to me that so many women doubt their ability to manage their fertile window manage their fertility without hormones. And so it's refreshing and important to hear that it is possible to not be on hormones and avoid pregnancy, even when you are absolutely not at all at a zero on the conception scale, like you don't want a baby. It is possible to successfully prevent pregnancy without hormones. So thank you for iterating that.
Absolutely.
Because so many women just kind of, it's normal to feel scared and to doubt your ability to do it, but it's helpful to hear like, no, it is actually possible. It is a thing.
Yeah, I know. And it's sad too. I have a lot of friends and just acquaintances in my social circle that think I'm absolutely nuts for not being on any form of hormonal birth control. And again, it's like you said, it's only like, oh, it's a matter of time. It's going to happen to you. You may have gotten lucky this month, but it's bound to happen, and it's just, it's sad and almost frustrating that I feel bad that just other women do not have that knowledge and understanding of their own reproductive cycles to know that, like, obviously, if you're not having a regular menstrual cycle, you can't be for sure. You don't know when you're ovulating, if you're even ovulating. There are a lot of precautions that you need to take, and especially directly coming off of a hormonal birth control. My partner and I were so cautious for the first several months because, it was just so unpredictable, like what my body was going to do withdrawing from those hormones. But I feel very confident in telling people now that I've been doing this for almost 2 years at this point, just knowing that my cycles are very spot on. I can trust that my body, the signals that it's putting out, and I know when I'm ovulating, and it's refreshing. And I try to just keep encouraging women that I'm not telling you have to get off birth control. If it's comfortable for you and it works for your lifestyle and you're not having any adverse symptoms, then, go for it. But I will always try to be the one challenging people to really try to just understand what, our reproductive cycles are, and just gaining that knowledge. Knowledge is power when it comes to your health. And I'm always trying to advocate for people to just learn more about their bodies.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate you taking the time to come on the show and share your experience. This is a really powerful conversation that we had. And like I said, you've really been through it with birth control. And so I recognize that every woman's experience is different, but it is important to know what the possible risks are with any type of contraceptive method. So I do really appreciate you taking the time to share your story.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's my pleasure. And I love getting to talk to people about my experiences because, like you said, it's not to say that this is going to happen to everyone, and it probably won't happen to most people. But I think the more that we can keep this conversation going and just letting women know out there that if your current form of birth control is not working for you, you have other options. So yeah, it's just a very important conversation to have. And I appreciate all the work that you do too with this podcast and your Facebook community. I mean, I know when I was navigating through this process for the first time, trying to learn about fertility awareness and just naturally tracking my cycle, I mean, it is very confusing and it's a little intimidating, but there's so many resources and great communities out there, both in person and online. I mean, women have a lot of support, and I think that we're going to keep moving this conversation forward.
Yes, definitely. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please share it with a friend. You'll find the show notes page for today's episode over at fertilityfriday.com/310. I hope that you enjoyed my interview with Amanda. I mean, what a powerful conversation. I definitely had tears in my eyes as she was describing her experience. And really, this is the reason why I do this. It's so important for us to listen and hear the experiences that women have had. Obviously, it's, not the most common experience to have the most egregious side effects of birth control, but it does happen. And there are women who have experienced this, obviously. And so it's more common than we think. I was looking at an article, and one of the challenges when talking about the most egregious side effects is that our medical community tends to minimize all of the side effects, including the most egregious ones. So minimizing the most egregious side effects like blood clot, stroke, pulmonary embolism, etc., by saying that the risk is so small, almost making it seem like, no, it doesn't happen to anybody because the risk is so small. But even if there's a small risk, there's an estimated 100 million women around the world who take hormonal birth control. So given a number that large, even if it's a small percentage of women who are going to experience it, that's a large number of actual human beings that could. And so there, in the one study that I was looking at, I quoted from the study on my Instagram recently. So if you don't follow me on Instagram yet, I'm at Fertility Friday. But I quoted from a study, and the estimate based on the US population was about 300 women could die per year. And that's deaths, not necessarily all of the women who actually experience these egregious side effects and live to tell the tale. So that's potentially thousands, if not tens of thousands of women every year who do experience blood clot, stroke, pulmonary embolism, etc. So with that in mind, I think what to take away from this episode is that it is possible. Hormonal birth control is actually a drug, and it does actually have side effects ranging from depression, anxiety, low libido, and those non-life-threatening side effects with actual life-threatening side effects. And it does happen, and we should listen to the stories of women who's happened to. The other thing I think we should take from this interview is that because it does happen, women should be adequately counseled about the possible signs and symptoms of these egregious side effects. So although the risk may be small on an absolute or on a statistical level, women actually do experience it. And so, for example, if you experience headaches ranging from moderate to severe or migraines with aura when you're taking an estrogen-containing birth control, having migraines while taking hormonal birth control should at least warrant a conversation with your doctor to determine if an estrogen-containing hormonal birth control method is the most suitable for you. Women who experience migraine with aura who take estrogen-containing birth control are at a higher risk of experiencing like a stroke or some of these more severe side effects. So even just having these conversations about, although the risk statistically is small, it is a risk and women do experience it. So if you ever experience migraines that are increasingly getting worse and not going away, come back to me. If you ever experience pain, such as the pain that could be caused by blood clots, so if you pain in your chest, different areas of the body, then these would be signs for you to potentially come and talk to me. And this theme has run through a lot of these episodes, the Pill Reality series episodes, whether we're talking about depression, anxiety, low libido, recurrent yeast infections, or whether we're talking about the risk of an ectopic pregnancy when you have an IUD inserted. Either way, these are risk factors that we should be aware of, even if the risk is small, and we should be aware of the symptoms so that if you experience those, you have somewhere to go. And I feel like that's a completely reasonable statement to make. I feel like there's no excuse for not giving women the tools that they need so that they can seek medical attention in that rare experience of having one of those side effects that's uncommon. Because at the end of the day, like, women are experiencing it. So I hope that you enjoyed today's episode. I'd love to hear your comments. You'll find the show notes page over at fertilityfriday.com/310. Yeah, wow, that's 310 episodes. That just occurred to me. That's a lot. And we'll also be talking about this in the Fertility Friday Facebook community. So if you're not in there, fertilityfriday.com/community. If you were waiting till the last minute to join us in Fertility Awareness Mastery Live, so this is my group coaching program where we go deeply into fertility awareness charting and really support you on your fertility awareness journey. The doors are closing right away here because we're starting in a few days. So if you're listening to this in real time, we start May 5th, 2020. Make sure to join us. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/FAM, FAM. So that's fertilityfriday.com/FAM. And at the time that I'm recording this, I still have spots available. If you go to the website and you'll see if the spots are full. So if registration is open, we still have a spot left. And if not, you'll see the notice there if it's closed. So with that, I want to thank you for tuning into the show today, for supporting the show. I really appreciate all of you for spreading the word. I love seeing all of you tag me on social media, tagging your friends in posts and just sharing the knowledge of fertility awareness. It's so important for us to be able to have access to this knowledge, whether we use this as a birth control method or not. It is so empowering for us to learn how our bodies work and for us to just know and realize that we have choices beyond hormonal birth control. We can manage our fertility however suits us best, really. And it's so empowering to know that we don't have to do this in just one way. And so have a wonderful weekend whenever you're listening to this episode. And of course, as always, until next time, be well and happy charting.